Good evening. This is a lecture on the future of Turkey. The future of Turkey is dangerous and uncertain. That's the bottom line. Speaking from here in May 2016, this actually seems like something that is unfolding before our very eyes. If we look at the numbers, the economic numbers of Turkey, they actually don't look too bad. The GDP at purchasing power parity count is more than $1.5 trillion. The growth rate has slowed down, but it was still approximately 3% in 2015. GDP per capita of Turkey at purchasing power parity remains at $20,500, which makes it firmly a middle-income country by these figures. Its saving rate is 16%, which could be higher. Turkey is not China, clearly, but it is okay. Turkey has a high level of household consumption in its GDP, 68.2%. Government expenditures are low at 15% or so. Investment is close to 20%, which is again not bad, but it is not China, clearly. Turkey has a labor force of almost 30 million people, and 1.2 million Turks work abroad, mainly in Europe. Agriculture still employs more than 1/4 of the workforce in Turkey. Industry employment has been going up, so it is actually slightly higher than the agricultural employment percentage at 26.2%. Main source of employment in Turkey, like in many developing countries, is in services. Unemployment rate is quite high, even by official rate count in Turkey. In 2015, by official statistics, it was 10.4. One could safely say that given the disguised unemployment in a place like Turkey and the undercounting of the unemployed is probably close to 15%. The people below poverty line in Turkey, that percentage is about 17%, which I think is a bit of an understatement. Turkey does run a budget deficit. It's 1.7% of GDP, so nothing to be worried about too much. Their debt is also low. It's 33.1% of GDP. Their inflation rate is lower than 10 digits. It's 7.5%, lower than 2 digits. Lower than 10% is what I meant. It's 7.5%, and they have a current account deficit of almost $33 billion, but it's not really that much of a deficit. But if you look at the export-import structure of Turkey, it is clear that Turkey is not quite the kind of industrial power that people sometimes think it is. It exports mainly apparel, foodstuffs, and textiles, some metal, and some low-end transport equipment. And it imports, of course, energy, chemicals, fuels of all sorts, transport equipment at the higher end, and manufactured goods at the higher end. The exchange rate of Turkey has been dropping from being 1.675 in 2011. Now Turkish lira has been devalued to 2.739. And Turkey actually focuses more on its immediate area in terms of geopolitics, Russia, Ukraine. It is concerned internally about the Kurds, and especially PKK, and of course Kurds in Syria now. Turkish military, although it has lost the kind of prominence that it used to have in politics, is still quite forceful. This is one factor that we don't quite know. But Turkish Land Forces Command works with NATO. NATO has a Land Forces Command in Izmir. Also Turkey is part of the AN/TPY-2 radar system of NATO missile defense. Turkey wants to present itself as a NATO ally and is quite intent, sometimes it seems, on dragging NATO forces, Europeans as well as North Americans, into its regional conflict, on which I will spend the rest of this talk. With the gradual coming to prominence of Erdogan and his regime in that area, Turkey, of course, has pursued its traditional policy of being friendly, or at least not being unfriendly, to Israel, and being more and more aggressive, indeed expansionist in terms of intentions, if not actual effect, towards the Middle East that used to be part of the Ottoman Empire at one time. Some people have called this neo-Ottoman foreign policy, but that I think is going a bit too far, because I don't think there is a consensus within the Turkish establishment with regards to this. When I was in Europe recently, I spoke with a number of people, including those who are close to NATO, and there are disagreements, of course, within NATO, but more importantly, disagreements within Turkey itself, especially within the Turkish military, as to how far, how fast Turkey wants to expand and how much risk it should take in terms of being aggressive towards Iran, towards Syria, towards the Kurds, and even towards Russia, and especially Russian hold in the Black Sea area, and there is also the relationship with Armenia, which also has border with Turkey. So Turkey has indeed a foreign policy dilemma if it does not want to be a status quo power in that region. And right now, that I think is the big strategic debate in Turkey. Add to that the traditional hostility between the Kurds and the Turks. It may well be true, as one analyst who focused on Syria particularly pointed out, that there is a great sorting out, to use his words, in Middle East going on today, by which he really meant that elimination of minorities in the way that it was done in Europe, in Eastern Europe, especially in places like Poland, and in Turkey, with the elimination of the Armenians, for example, and the Christians and the Greeks. He wasn't quite clear on the point that the last remaining minority problem in Turkey remains the Kurds, who are not about to roll over and commit mass suicide. In fact, the history of Kurdish autonomy movement, indeed independence movement, has been one of both armed struggle and political struggle, including alliance building. But the recent aggressive stance, indeed the repressive stance of the Erdogan government towards PKK basically has put to rest the political side of PKK strategy. And now if PKK still wants to lead the Kurds, it has to adopt a more militant strategy. And de facto on ground in Syria, Kurds have formed their own autonomous government, And Turkey, of course, is hostile and is doing everything it can to undermine that government, if not overthrow it by force. PKK is friendly towards the Kurds in Syria. On the other hand, the overall strategy is not clear. PKK traditionally has been much more pro-people, indeed more of a leftist socialist orientation, and there is a division within the ranks of PKK as to whether it should tone down on those things, even as it extols the role of women in fighting the regressive forces in Syrian Kurdistan, or which is to them Syrian Kurdistan, and to what extent an alliance can be maintained with the Iraqi Kurdish regime, which is basically quite capitalist and centered around two powerful, wealthy families. So there are all kinds of internal tensions among the Kurds in Turkey, in Syria, and in Iraq mainly, and within PKK itself. And what stance PKK should take towards US imperialism is another big question that divides the militants in PKK. So given all these things, there are complexities on both the ruling Turkish side and also on the PKK and Kurdish side. That makes things quite uncertain. And add to that the uncertainty with respect to the existing regimes, especially the Syrian regime, but also the Iraqis. Iraq by now de facto is a Shia state, and of course Iran. So this alliance with Saudi Arabia and the Gulf countries, which are among the most reactionary and regressive states, not just in the region but in the world, puts Turkey in a very bad light. And Turkish democracy itself has been curtailed, and human rights and political freedoms of all sorts have been repressed in Turkey. Faced with this kind of repression, it's also a good question how long the Turkish population itself will remain quiet and submissive. So all these really lead us to characterize the situation both geopolitically and internally within Turkey as highly uncertain. Turkey is facing, I think, quite possibly massive instability in the future. It may take place within the next few years. So all bets are off as far as Turkey is concerned right now. Thank you.